In the quiet moments before sleep, let us drift into the past, into the shadowed world of war and politics, of decisions made beneath flickering lamps and in smoke-filled rooms. Our story tonight follows one man, Winston Churchill, through the storm of the First World War. Not yet the lion of the Second World War, not yet a household name, but ambitious, restless, and destined for trials that would test his soul. Close your eyes and picture gaslit London in the early 1900s. Horses clatter on cobbled streets. Letters are written by candlelight. Ships steam silently across cold seas. Churchill was already a figure of note, brash, eloquent, and ever striving upward. And as Europe inched toward catastrophe, he stood near the heart of power, eager to shape events. Let this story unfold gently with the hush of night around you. The world was about to change, and Churchill with it. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born into privilege, yet always felt he had something to prove. As a young man, he charged into danger with pen and sword alike, reporting from wars in Cuba, Sudan, and South Africa. He sought glory not only on the battlefield but in Parliament, where his wit and force of will were both admired and resented. By 1908, he had become president of the Board of Trade, then Home Secretary. Known for boldness more than caution, he clashed with tradition at every turn. He switched political parties, not once but twice, first a conservative, then a liberal, chasing reform and relevance. He loved history, writing, and speech-making, and longed to leave a mark. At just 39, he became First Lord of the Admiralty, Britain's top naval official. War loomed on the horizon, and Churchill believed it might offer his greatest opportunity yet. He did not yet know how heavy that cost would be. The world before the war was fragile, an intricate web of treaties, ambitions, and misunderstandings. In drawing rooms and royal courts, alliances formed like cracks in glass. Britain watched uneasily as Germany's power grew, especially at sea. Naval supremacy was the pride of the British Empire, and now it was being challenged. Churchill at the Admiralty took this threat seriously. He modernized the fleet, introduced oil-fueled ships, and expanded naval air power. While diplomats exchanged cautious words, Europe teetered on the edge. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914 was the spark that ignited the fire. Churchill pushed for readiness. War, he felt, was inevitable. By August, Britain declared war on Germany after its armies swept through Belgium. The Great War had begun. Millions would march. Empires would fall. And Churchill, driven by energy and conviction, would step boldly into the storm, believing he could shape its course, not yet imagining how it might break him. In 1911, Winston Churchill took command of the Royal Navy as First Lord of the Admiralty. It was a post of immense power, second only to the Prime Minister in wartime significance. Churchill embraced it with zeal. He visited dockyards, toured ships, and grilled admirals on every detail. He pressed for modernization, faster battleships, submarines, and naval aviation. He believed technology would win the next war, and he wanted Britain ready. Not everyone welcomed his intensity. Some saw him as meddlesome, too eager, too young. But Churchill pressed on, convinced the Navy must evolve. He oversaw the construction of the mighty Queen Elizabeth-class battleships and helped prepare plans for war long before the first shot was fired. As war drew closer, Churchill was in his element, surrounded by maps and cables, relishing the command of one of the world's most powerful fleets. The chessboard was set. Soon, the pieces would move, and Churchill would move with them. Churchill loved the sea, the hum of engines, the salt of wind, the promise of steel ships under starlit skies. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he poured energy into preparing Britain's Navy for the coming storm. He wasn't a sailor by training, but he learned fast, surrounding himself with experienced officers and endless reports. Under his direction, the fleet modernized at pace. Oil replaced coal. Submarines became more than a curiosity. Aircraft were launched from ships for the first time. It was the largest and most powerful navy in the world, and Churchill intended to keep it so. He believed a strong navy would deter Germany, or defeat her if needed. He often visited ships in person, speaking directly to crews, drinking tea below decks, inspecting gunnery drills. He loved the atmosphere of command. The war was still in its early stages, but the sea was already a crucial battlefield. Churchill stood at the helm. Even before war was declared, Churchill felt its breath on his neck. He watched Germany closely. its maneuvers, its growing fleet, its swift aggression. In July 1914, as Europe staggered toward conflict, Churchill was among the first to act. He ordered the British fleet to its war stations, silent, swift, and without fanfare. The Navy moved like a shadow across the water. At midnight on August 4th, war was declared. Churchill didn't hesitate. He sent the fleet to blockade German ports and protect vital shipping routes. Telegraphs crackled, lights dimmed. He slept little, driven by urgency and responsibility. Already he was making bold decisions, sometimes ahead of government consensus. He authorized the occupation of wireless stations, ordered the capture of German ships, and even began naval operations against German colonies abroad. The sea, he knew, would be a deciding factor in the war's outcome, and Churchill intended Britain to own the waves, however long the night. The world changed in August 1914. In muddy fields and quiet towns, the sound of marching boots echoed. In the English Channel and North Sea, British ships cut across the waves, ready to intercept the German fleet. The Royal Navy quickly secured dominance, bottling up enemy ships and protecting vital trade routes. Churchill oversaw every detail: routes, rations, signals, fuel. One of his earliest crises was the escape of the German battlecruiser Goeben, which fled to Turkey and altered the diplomatic balance in the East. Churchill raged but learned quickly. He sent ships to shell German coastal towns, hoping to demonstrate strength and raise British morale. In Parliament and the press, he was a visible, energetic leader, speaking with passion, visiting wounded sailors, urging ever more daring tactics. To Churchill, this war was a test of will and imagination. He meant to meet it head-on, through innovation and relentless action. The guns had spoken, and he answered. In October 1914, Churchill made a bold and controversial decision. As German forces swept through Belgium, the city of Antwerp stood as a last stronghold. Believing its defense crucial to halting the German advance, Churchill personally traveled there, bringing British Marines to reinforce the garrison. Dressed in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, he walked among soldiers, inspected trenches, and directed defensive plans. He stayed for days, writing home excitedly, but the plan was flawed. The Germans brought heavy artillery, and Antwerp was poorly fortified. British forces could not hold the line. After fierce fighting, the city fell. Though some Belgian and British troops escaped, the episode damaged Churchill's reputation. Critics saw it as reckless, a waste of lives. Yet Churchill remained convinced it had delayed the German advance toward the Channel ports. Still, the sting remained. War, he was learning, punished enthusiasm as harshly as error. Not all daring moves brought glory. Some brought only ghosts. By late 1914, the Western Front had become a stalemate. Trenches, mud, and unimaginable loss. Churchill, ever seeking bold alternatives, set his eyes eastward. He imagined a different front, a way to knock the Ottoman Empire from the war and link up with Russia. The plan? Force a passage through the Dardanelles Strait, seize Constantinople, and change the war's course. It was daring, even visionary. Churchill pressed it forward with urgency. He believed a strong naval assault could succeed without a full land invasion. The idea gained support, but there were doubts. The strait was narrow, mined, and fiercely defended. Still, the operation was approved. British and French warships began preparations, and troops, including Australians and New Zealanders, were assembled. For Churchill, this was a chance to outflank the deadlock of France and Belgium. He believed history would remember the stroke of genius. What came next, however, would become one of the war's great tragedies and his greatest failure. In March 1915, the Dardanelles campaign began with a naval assault. Churchill watched anxiously as British and French ships moved through the narrow straits, firing on Ottoman forts. But progress was slow. Mines lay hidden beneath the surface, and Turkish gunners struck with deadly accuracy. Several ships were sunk, and others heavily damaged. The Admiralty hesitated. Rather than risk the fleet, a land invasion was ordered to follow. Churchill had hoped to avoid this. He wanted speed, surprise, and minimal casualties. But now, Allied troops would have to land on the rugged Gallipoli Peninsula. The planning was rushed. Maps were vague. Command uncertain. Still, Churchill clung to hope. He believed the Ottomans would break under pressure, that Constantinople could be taken. Yet the seeds of disaster were already sown. On distant shores, men readied for battle. In London, Churchill studied maps late into the night, willing his plan to succeed, but the tides would not obey. At dawn on April 25, 1915, Allied troops landed on the shores of Gallipoli. The beaches were steep, narrow, and exposed. The men, Australians, New Zealanders, British, and French, waded ashore under withering fire. It was chaos from the start. Terrain was misunderstood, maps were inaccurate. Commanders hesitated, supplies piled up on beaches. Still, the soldiers climbed the cliffs, dug trenches, and fought bravely. Churchill followed every report from London, his hopes high. He believed success was near, that the Ottomans would soon collapse. But the defenders were fierce and determined. Turkish commander Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, rallied his men, held the line, and turned the tide. The front froze into another deadlock. Gallipoli became a new kind of nightmare. Dust, thirst, heat, and shellfire. Days dragged into weeks. Churchill still believed, but the facts were grim. The landings had not broken the enemy. They had opened a wound that would only deepen with time. Summer on Gallipoli brought misery. Swarms of flies, blistering heat, and the stench of the dead haunted the trenches. Water was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Every advance ended in slaughter. The Allies launched new offensives. The August landings at Suvla Bay, bloody attacks at Lone Pine and Chunuk Bair. But none achieved the breakthrough Churchill had imagined. Supplies were mismanaged, communication poor, Turkish resistance remained unbroken. Back in London, Churchill's position weakened. Critics grew louder. What had seemed daring now appeared disastrous. The cabinet questioned the campaign's future. Field reports painted a grim picture. Soldiers held ground, but at terrible cost. Morale waned. Even supporters of the plan began to waver. Churchill, deeply invested in the outcome, urged reinforcements. More ships, more men, more time. But confidence had eroded. The bold stroke he envisioned had turned into a brutal slog. The dream of Gallipoli was dying, and with it, part of Churchill's political standing. By autumn, Gallipoli was seen as a failure. The beaches were still held, but no victory was in sight. In Parliament and the press, questions turned to blame. Churchill, once hailed as a brilliant strategist, now faced bitter scrutiny. Members of the government turned against him. The Conservative Party demanded a coalition, and Prime Minister Asquith agreed. A new war council was formed, and Churchill was pushed aside. His voice diminished. His influence waned. He argued passionately that the campaign could still succeed. He defended the vision, the need for boldness, the importance of the Dardanelles. But the tide had turned. Soldiers continued to suffer on the cliffs and in the gullies of Gallipoli. At home, the public grew restless. Churchill's energy, once admired, now seemed reckless. Gallipoli had become a symbol, not of strategic vision, but of human cost. The backlash was swift, and for Churchill, the blow was not just political, it was deeply personal. Stripped of power, Churchill could no longer bear to sit idly. In November 1915, he resigned from the government. He felt betrayed, isolated, and restless. This was not how he imagined his wartime role ending, not behind a desk, reduced to silence, blamed for failure. He had gambled on Gallipoli and lost. With his career in crisis, he retreated to the countryside with his wife Clementine. He took long walks, he wrote, and to the surprise of many, he began to paint. It brought him solace, dabs of color replacing telegrams and battle maps. He painted landscapes, still lifes, and eventually battle scenes. Friends visited. Days passed in quiet reflection. Yet his mind never left the war. He read every report, marked every loss. The roar of politics faded, replaced by the whisper of wind and trees. But inside him, the fire still burned. He was not done. Not yet. The war still called. Churchill's days at Hoe Farm were quieter, filled with birdsong and brushstrokes, yet grief hung over him like fog. He felt the deaths at Gallipoli keenly, each report a wound. Though surrounded by family, he struggled with doubt. His career lay in ruins. His name was mocked in newspapers. The brush became his refuge. He once said that painting was like opening the shutters and letting in light. Each canvas helped him breathe again. Clementine, ever his anchor, urged him to rest. Friends urged patience. But Churchill remained restless. He read books on military history, war diaries, and strategy. He walked for hours through the fields. The world outside was at war, but for a time, he was at war only with himself. His hands, once waving at crowds and generals, now steadied pallets and oils. Yet even in mourning, he plotted a return, not for pride alone, but for purpose. The war was not yet over. Unable to remain a spectator, Churchill took an extraordinary step. In early 1916, he applied for active military service and was accepted. At 41, he became Lieutenant Colonel of the 6th Battalion, Royal Scots Fusiliers. It was a symbolic return, a humbling step. He left behind Parliament and headed for the Western Front. In France, he was greeted with mixed reactions. Some respected the gesture, others saw it as a stunt. But Churchill took the role seriously. He lived in a simple billet, wore a muddy uniform, and shared hardships with his men. He toured trenches, organized defenses, and endured artillery fire. Letters home spoke of long nights, deep mud, and the strange silence between bombardments. For a time, he was just another officer in a war of millions. In the cold dawn, among rats and wire, Churchill found a kind of peace, not in victory, but in shared struggle. He had come to bear witness. The Western Front was not glorious. It was mud, blood, and waiting. Churchill's trench line near Ploegsteert, Belgium, was quiet by war standards, but danger still lurked. The men built dugouts, reinforced wire, watched the enemy. Shells could fall at any hour. Churchill walked the lines daily, inspecting defenses, chatting with troops. He carried cigars in his coat, sketched enemy positions, and sent endless memos to superiors. He tried to improve life for his men, better rations, cleaner quarters, more ammunition. Despite his rank, he ate the same food, endured the same cold. Soldiers respected that. At night, the sound of distant shelling echoed softly through the darkness. He read books in a tiny room, wrote to Clementine, and kept a journal. The front gave him perspective, war not as theory, but as suffering. Churchill was no longer just a planner of battles. He was now one of the many who lived beneath their shadow. From the trenches, Churchill wrote frequently to Clementine, letters filled with longing, wit, and flashes of melancholy. He described his dugout, his soldiers, the rain that never seemed to end. He spoke of watching over men as they slept, of the silence before dawn, of sudden gunfire that shattered calm. But he also wrote of ideas, of strategy, politics, and the future. Even in a muddy trench, his mind ranged far. He missed his children, missed Parliament, missed purpose. Yet he was determined to endure. Writing helped him cope. He joked about poor rations, rats the size of cats, and woolen socks that never dried. At times, he grew philosophical. "It is very cold here," he once wrote, "but the soul is colder when unused." His letters were not just updates, they were lifelines. Between the lines, a man reshaped by war emerged, quieter, more patient, but still burning with ambition. The pen was again his sword. By mid-1916, pressure mounted for Churchill's return to politics. Though Gallipoli still haunted him, many recognized his energy and talent. Britain needed strong administrators, and the Ministry of Munitions was overstretched. Friends urged him to return. Opponents grumbled. In May 1916, Churchill left the trenches and re-entered Parliament. He faced a cold reception. The war had changed the country. Old alliances had shifted. Suspicion lingered. But Churchill began rebuilding. He spoke less often, but with greater care. He met with factory officials, listened more, and worked steadily to restore trust. He knew that leadership required not only boldness, but humility. In quiet committee rooms and under flickering gaslights, he laid the groundwork for a second act. He no longer craved the spotlight as before. Now, he wanted to serve and perhaps to redeem. Though battle-scarred in reputation, he remained relentless. The war continued, and Churchill, once disgraced, would soon hold power again. In July 1917, Churchill was appointed Minister of Munitions, a critical wartime post. The role was vast: oversee weapons factories, ensure supply lines, manage labor, and meet the insatiable demands of a modern army. It was not glamorous, but it was vital. Churchill threw himself into it with focus. He visited plants, spoke with workers, and tackled bottlenecks in production. He introduced reforms, cut red tape, and boosted output. Under his watch, shells flowed to the front in greater numbers than ever before. He faced strikes, shortages, and political resistance, but met them all with his usual mix of pressure and persuasion. He encouraged the use of women workers and visited them often, praising their efforts. Though far from the battlefield, he was again at the heart of the war effort. Churchill had learned from past mistakes. Now he led not through daring gambles, but steady, vital work. Redemption, slow but real, was taking root. Behind every shell fired on the Western Front, there were thousands of hands at work. Churchill knew that wars were not won by armies alone, but by steel, sweat, and unbroken supply chains. As Minister of Munitions, he transformed British industry into a war machine. He expanded production, improved transportation, and pushed for new technologies. The home front became a battlefield of its own. Factories ran day and night, powered by women, young boys, and wounded veterans. Churchill visited often, in overcoat and bowler, shaking hands, giving speeches, urging speed. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, and perseverance. He worked with engineers to improve tanks, encouraged chemical weapons development, and approved aircraft designs. While generals fought with rifles and maps, Churchill fought with quotas and production charts. His energy never wavered. He had found a new rhythm, less glory, more grit. The war was grinding toward conclusion, and Churchill was once again central to Britain's fight. In April 1917, a new force entered the war, America. With fresh troops, vast resources, and the will to act, the United States tipped the balance. Churchill welcomed the news with cautious hope. He had long admired the energy of the American people and corresponded with U.S. figures. Now that strength was arriving in Europe. American factories revved to life. Soldiers poured into France. Morale lifted across the Allied lines. In London, Churchill knew this was the beginning of the end for the Central Powers. He met with American officials, visited military observers, and adapted British production to support joint efforts. The war became more coordinated. Allied logistics, combined strategies, shared intelligence. Churchill called for unity and reminded Parliament that victory required endurance to the final day. The tide was turning, and though battles still raged, the finish line felt nearer than ever. Hope stirred again, like dawn after a long, black night. By late 1918, German forces were faltering. Allied offensives pushed forward, and the German home front crumbled under strain. In the ministry, Churchill worked tirelessly, expanding ammunition stocks, aiding France's supply lines, and pressing for greater tank use. His energy inspired some, exhausted others. He sensed that history was turning. Each telegram brought new gains, villages reclaimed, trenches abandoned, enemy lines collapsing. Yet he never allowed complacency. Wars are not won, he said, until the last shot is fired. Churchill met with generals, labor leaders, and engineers to maintain pressure. He emphasized urgency. The end, when it came fast. Mutinies broke out in Germany. Austria-Hungary disintegrated. The Ottomans surrendered. And finally, after 4 years of agony, the Great War ground to a halt. Churchill had lived to see victory, but not without scars. His journey through the war was one of failure, endurance, and renewal. And soon, the bells would ring. November 11th, 1918. At 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. Across Europe, soldiers emerged from trenches, stunned by the stillness. In London, crowds gathered, cheering, crying, singing. Churchill, now deep in government work, allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The war was over. Millions were dead. Empires had fallen. Maps would be redrawn. But for that 1 hour, peace held the world in its arms. Churchill wrote later of the strange quiet, that after years of noise and chaos, silence was deafening. He walked outside, watching people celebrate, wondering what would come next. Gallipoli still haunted him. So did the faces of men lost in Flanders and France. Yet he also felt resolve. Britain had endured. And Churchill, once disgraced, had endured with it. He had helped deliver the means of victory, if not always the vision. Armistice Day was both an end and a beginning, a moment to breathe, a chapter closed. Churchill's role in the war was uneven, brilliant at times, disastrous at others. He had helped modernize the Navy, seen failure at Gallipoli, served in the trenches, and managed wartime industry. Few others had touched so many parts of the conflict. He learned from defeat, adapted to new roles, and never lost his drive to contribute. Many still blamed him for Gallipoli, but others saw the depth of his commitment. He had taken risks, some wise, some costly, but always with full conviction. As the war ended, Churchill began writing his account, eager to shape how history would remember it. He met with military leaders, contributed to peace talks, and warned of post-war instability. He believed deeply that history was written not just in events, but in how those events were told. He was not yet the legend he would become, but he was no longer the reckless minister of 1915. War had shaped him anew. Though victory had come, Churchill could never fully escape Gallipoli. The names of the dead stayed with him. The young Australians, New Zealanders, and British troops who perished on distant cliffs. He returned to the subject often, in books and speeches, sometimes defending, sometimes mourning. In quiet moments, he revisited the maps, the photographs, the letters. He called it an enterprise of fine conception, ill-starred in execution. He wondered what might have been. Had the mines been cleared sooner? Had more troops landed earlier? The questions had no answers. Gallipoli was a weight he would carry for decades. Yet even in failure, he found meaning. He had seen war from above and below, from cabinet table to dugout. He had been humbled, tested, changed. The ghosts never left him, but neither did the lessons. They became part of him, part of what made him later rise when others fell. Gallipoli had nearly ended him, but it didn't. Churchill emerged from the war older, wearier, and wiser. He no longer charged ahead without pause. He had seen too much, disaster and redemption, trenches and triumph. His speeches became more measured, his strategies more considered. He had learned the price of boldness and the value of patience. The young firebrand of 1914 was now a statesman tempered by loss. Yet he remained fiercely ambitious. He believed Britain must not only survive peace, but lead it. He threw himself into post-war reconstruction, army reform, and debates over Irish independence and Bolshevism. Some loved his energy, others mistrusted his instincts, but no one doubted his presence. He was still a man of history, and history had not finished with him. The First World War had changed Churchill. It had wounded, tested, and in strange ways prepared him. The lion's roar would come later. But the man who would lead Britain through its darkest hour was already awakening. Looking back, Churchill often said the Great War was the most terrible of all his experiences, not because of danger, but because of how it tested the soul. He had faced disgrace, boredom, fear, and regret. He had seen young men die by the tens of thousands for inches of land. Yet he had also seen resilience, invention, and courage. The war shaped his instincts. Prepare early, adapt fast, lead boldly. It taught him humility, and it taught him that victory does not come from one great stroke, but from perseverance. In speeches, he called the war a furnace that forged Britain's character, and his own. Churchill would carry its lessons into the future, into rearmament, into speeches before Parliament, and finally into the fight against Hitler. The First World War was not the end of his journey. It was the crucible in which he was made, a man born of fire and endurance. In the years after the war, Churchill watched Europe drift toward darkness again. Peace was uneasy. Empires had fallen, but old grudges smoldered. He warned Parliament that Germany must not rise unchecked. He spoke of air power, tanks, and the need to remain vigilant. Many dismissed him as a relic of war, a man obsessed with ghosts. But Churchill had seen what happened when nations failed to act in time. Gallipoli, the trenches, the long lists of the dead, they had left their mark. He saw patterns repeating, old illusions returning. Though out of office at times, he never stopped speaking, writing, preparing. The man who had stumbled during the First World War would become the voice of defiance in the Second. His memories of war shaped every word, every warning. He had lived through one cataclysm, and he would not let the world sleepwalk into another, at least not without a fight. And now, as you lie in stillness, let Churchill's story fade into the hush of night. Not the legend, but the man, flawed, driven, and deeply human. In World War I, he saw ambition undone and pride humbled. He saw soldiers brave beyond reason and mistakes that cost lives. He learned to lead, not just to command. He walked the muddy lines, felt the sting of disgrace, and rose again. The story of Churchill in the Great War is not only one of power and battle, but of endurance, of learning when to act and when to wait. As the world changed around him, he changed too. Let the distant echoes of gunfire fade. Let the maps roll up. Let the lamps dim again. For in every leader's past are nights like these, long, dark, and filled with questions. Sleep now, beneath the weight of history. Tomorrow brings new trials, but tonight we remember and we rest.